Jason, it is such a privilege to be here with you tonight. I just love this book so much,
Well,
and
thank
I'm
you.
really excited to be able to share it with all the people who are participating in the audience tonight. I was hoping that we could get started a little bit by, for the people who haven't read it yet, so go out and get your copy. Uh, if you could just start a little bit by giving people a taste of what your book is about.
First of all, Laura, thank you so much for hosting this conversation. And I am thrilled to be able to answer that question in front of an audience of scholars rather than an audience of Hollywood executives, because I have a hard time answering that question, what it's about, what kind of book it is in like a 15-second elevator ride. But I think of it, it's a book of nonfiction. I think of it as historical storytelling, if that's not too oxymoronic, and it's also framed as a memoir. Um, the uh, the book grew out of a flat that my husband and I bought in an 1875 townhouse in my hometown of Savannah. The real estate listing billed the townhouse as the Solomon Cohen house. I was immediately suspicious because, first of all, I'd never heard of it or Solomon Cohen, and I can assure you they don't name the great houses in Savannah after Jews. So after we bought the flat, it was almost like a due diligence. I thought I better find out who this Solomon Cohen is. He really was a big macher in antebellum Savannah. He was a lawyer, banker, real estate developer. He was a district attorney. He was a postmaster. He was the postmaster both before the war and as part of the Confederacy. He was a synagogue president. He wore many hats, and he was also a staunch defender of slavery. And so I thought, okay, now I know who he is. But it was only when I dug in a little bit deeper and learned more about his family, his son Gratz Cohen, whose journal I found in the Georgia Historical Society there, and then Miriam Cohen and their larger extended family, which included Rebecca Gratz and a lot of kind of great names in 19th century American Jewry, that I kind of was hooked on this as a story. I had taken a tour, a slavery tour in Savannah called Footprints of Savannah. And the woman who led that tour, Lynette Goodwalker, also runs the Civil Rights Museum in Savannah. She became an ally of mine in this project and really kind of helped me, what she called, quote, slathering on the history to the story. But the more I learned, the less it was kind of a slather job than a kind of a deep dive. 19th century Savannah was not something I had known that much, that I knew that much about. And, Jewish history of that period, Jewish slave owning, I knew nothing about. So the more I learned, the more I was hooked, and it truly did become, I think, a work of history. But still, I foreground the characters because I'm primarily a fiction writer, and my previous book was a book of short stories. So I think that's where maybe this differs from, all the history books that I was reading, which is I tried to tell this as a kind of a family saga, and where the historical record was silent, meaning where I couldn't find diaries or letters. I speculated on maybe what these characters were thinking. I try to be clear about when I'm doing that so that it's clear, like when I'm speculating and when we're being factual. But so yeah, it's written, I would say, in a kind of a novelistic way, but it is a work of history. So yeah, that's where I get the idea of the historical storytelling as a genre. So
Yeah, I'm super curious. So for people who are obsessed with American Jewish history like I am, you'll this family is honestly kind of a gold mine because you'll kind of throw out it like, oh, and he happens to like interact with this person who's really important in terms of either Southern or Northern American Jewish history for the 19th century. So they really are well connected and at the center of a lot of different stories that are happening during the 19th century. One of the strands that I think is most interesting to me in some ways, just because you tell such a different side of it than anything I've read before, is the story about Gratz Cohen, who's the son of Solomon. And I wonder if you want to give us a little bit of an insight into what was so interesting about him, and also maybe what was unexpected, if anything, when you started looking into him.
Yeah, the historical record is full of Solomon Cohen. He was, I think, quite literally in the newspaper every day because of these the many roles he played in really institution building in Savannah. There wasn't you don't find any record of Gratz Cohen until he died. But as I said, I did, as part of my due diligence on Solomon Cohen, I did go to the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah, a beautiful old building, and they presented me with a two books, his autograph book, which is, I guess, the equivalent of kind of like a college yearbook. It was a blank book where all of his friends inscribed it, and then his journal kept during his years at University of Virginia, where he was the first Jewish student. So that would be 1862 through 1864. As I started to read it, it was just extremely intimate. There were he was a poet, so some of his poetry fell out, but almost immediately he started talking about some servant who, what he called a servant, was lost to him. And as I read the journal, I saw that the poetry and the journal entries that were sort of almost obsessively talking about this person who was identified in the journal and also in letters home as Lewis, was sort of one and the same person. So I guess on the surface, Gratz and I sort of share a lot of kind of biographical facts. I mean, he grew up on the same block where I now owned a home. He was born in Savannah and went north. He went to Virginia. I went to New Haven, so farther away, to sort of become ourselves. He was a very bookish person, wanted to be a writer, as I did. He was queer in the sense that, well, in many senses, but mostly in the sense that, I mean, his kind of deepest affective relationships were with men, including this person, Lewis, who was his enslaved valet. It seems his the way he wrote about him was so in some way coded, referring to kind of things they had done together, but it also just out and out, almost like love poetry with almost a promiscuous series of pet names, calling him, my genie, my elf, my names that kind of, Sancho Panza, my second self, my soul, my other half. This was a person who he was deeply connected to. He had a similar, I would say, kind of crushes on people at University of Virginia, other mates, but definitely this Lewis was someone who he was especially attached to. They grew up together, and now this was someone on whom he exercised his authority, and yet still seemed to have this extremely deep personal, emotional relationship with. So that was one of the things that interested me. You know, who was this Lewis and what was this relationship? And then the final thing I'd say about Gratz was the little bits of, I guess, the kind of one little biographical sketch I found, and then one obituary that I found, both laud him as a war hero. And when I was reading his journal, it seemed clear to me that he did everything he could, especially when he was living in Virginia. I mean, which was the hard part of the war in 62 to 64, to get out of fighting. He didn't want to fight. And it was only when he went back to Savannah and Sherman was approaching Savannah and his famous March to the Sea that, for whatever reason, he finally joined up and, got himself killed 3 weeks before Appomattox, under mysterious circumstances, in that the biographical sketch and the obituary have kind of conflicting explanations of how he died. So I guess, to sum it up, my fascination with Gratz was we shared enough on paper that he seemed like, in a way, a sort of doppelganger, and that's a trendy term these days, sort of doppelganger, but was different enough for me to want to bridge that gap and try to understand it. I have never gone to war. I would never, well, of course, we're looking, back at it from our perspective today, but why go to war when you've spent years trying to sit it out? Also, what were you fighting for? You're really going to fight for this cause? Finally, you're a Jew. How did Jews rationalize slavery when this was more a question for Solomon Cohen, when a liberation story is at the heart of our religion? So there were many ways in which I felt close to Gratz Cohen, but other ways in which I didn't feel that I understood him at all, and I wanted to know. So
Yeah, I think part of what is so interesting about your portrayal about him is he's such an enigma, right? Like he's so contradictory in really basic ways. And one of the things that I really appreciate about your biography of him is how you let him be complicated in ways that real human beings are, right? That we know that most people that we like and respect are complicated and hold like weird opinions. And the fact that he's both obsessed with Lewis and yet is fighting on behalf of a cause that clearly oppresses Lewis and doesn't seem to recognize his own oppression of Lewis is so interesting to see as how this young man is sort of coming of age, how he's understanding the world around him. So
yeah, yeah.
definitely one of the things that I think is maybe it's part of your background in fiction that helps you like allow the historical characters to be rich and complicated.
Yeah, I tried to. I mean, clearly the reason the Southerners were fighting this war was to um, uh, preserve the right to own slaves in the territories. I mean, that's very clear by what they said. I mean, if you just started to let every new state coming online vote on slavery, they were going to be possibly outnumbered and slavery is going to disappear. That seems clear from the Articles of Secession and everything that these people themselves wrote. However, a lot of recent scholarship, and certainly in the way Gratz wrote about it, talked about the role, I would say, the role kind of masculinity, boredom, seeking an adventure, wanting to prove yourself played in the personal decisions that these men went to war. Certainly, Gratz Cohen was, as someone who, you know, knew he was very attracted to men in a way that wasn't socially sanctioned. And also, just like his class at UVA was dwindling. There were like 15 people in his class. He had a disability exemption. He had some problem with his foot that caused him great pain simply to stand for periods of time. So he was exempt, and gradually that exemption was becoming harder and harder to sustain. But I just tried to imagine, I think that's right, Laura, kind of the way I would if I were creating Gratz as a character. But I kind of imagine, what would it be like to a young man who kind of looks whole of body and mind, walking around the streets of Charlottesville or Savannah, um, or Richmond at that time? The looks people would have given him, and certainly there was discourse from all the way up to the Secretary of the Army of the Confederacy talking about effeminate young men and their friends who got them exemptions. And he himself wrote openly about the fact that he had failed as a soldier, so he certainly felt that his masculinity was at stake. So I was really interested both in the macro reasons, which seemed quite established, about why the Southerners were fighting this crazy war, and also the kind of the personal reasons that people like Gratz Cohen had to actually go off and fight it. So.
Yeah, I think that a part of what makes your book so rich is that sort of interest in all these different aspects that what the characters bring up that are these bigger stories about what's going on with Jews and manhood and what goes on with disability and manhood and how does that play into a number of the crises that they're facing. What are the things sort of speaking to your expertise as a writer that you bring into this? And I will say, like, one of the things that was so lovely as a reader is that I read it, I was like, oh, this is somebody who knows how to write.
Oh, thank
You
you.
know, like a lot of times that um obviously I'm an academic and I think academics do great work, but you know, we don't always have those same strengths in terms of storytelling because it's not necessarily how we're trained. And so one of the things I was noticing was sort of your love of what I would call minor characters who are in dialogue with him. And I'm wondering if, do you want to tell us, I don't know if you have a favorite, like, person who kind of interacted with him or some of the other characters who wasn't like the main story, but who was sort of fascinating to you nonetheless. And if not, I'll
Um,
tell you who mine was, but
First of all, you know how to write, Laura. So that makes the compliment even greater. So thank you very much. Minor characters who interacted with Gratz. Well, I was interested in Emma Mordecai. I
that's
don't
who
know.
I was going to say too. So thank you.
I
Yeah.
will say when you talked about the rich vein, I mean, I published this with an academic press. And one of the great things about that was I had two anonymous readers who were academics and who could point me in the direction of veins that they found rich. So I ended up reading a lot about the Mordecais. I really just knew her as Gratz's aunt, but it was interesting the way he was at University of Virginia when there weren't a lot of eligible bachelors around, and he was really being introduced to a lot of young women. And he was always just running off to Richmond to hang out with his aunt Emma, who was a writer, just the way he aspired to be. And she also he was a sickly person, so she took care of him. He fled to her when he was trying to avoid conscription, and she advised him and took care of him and was kind of a mentor to him. So yeah, she was an interesting character. She was a kind of a different kind of person, I think, judging from her memoir and his. She was sort of a less overtly emotional person. I would think of probably a more rational type person. And there also seemed to be on maybe different sides on kind of the great debate of the day of orthodoxy versus reform. She was much more of a stickler for orthodoxy. I think maybe especially when all of her siblings were converting to Judaism, and Gratz instinctively felt that reform was the way to go. He thought that this day and age, these sort of rigid, hollow forms, the way we pray just make no sense. And yet they had common ground. So I like to kind of imagine what their conversations were like, kind of around the fireside. So
Yeah, I definitely, so she was definitely one of my favorites. So people may know her that she's one of the members of the Mordecai family in Richmond. As you said, her family ran a really important boarding school, and her father was a big advocate of orthodoxy. And I think Diane Ashton, who
mhm.
has a posthumous volume coming out of her diaries that should be coming out
Mm,
relatively soon. But she definitely is somebody where she kind of had a different role in this than I'd ever seen her play before. So I was really interested in how she was interacting with him and how she's kind of nurturing this young man. And like, it was a much more um, again, nurturing role that I'd seen with her before. I had written about one of her brothers in a previous book who had moved north and married another extended member of the Gratz family. And she was always nagging on him about his unwillingness to fight for the South. So it was really interesting to see her
mm.
kind of on her home turf, kind of being able to do something other than sort of complaining about things or, you know, being just rah rah South, but really see her interacting with human beings and sort of worrying
Yeah.
about them.
Yeah, I think Gratz elicited that response from people because he was a very delicate, sickly, sensitive, smart sort of young man. Very, I really kept thinking of, he would have been horrified by this comparison, but he was much like Abraham Lincoln that way. They were openly kind of sad people, kind of pensive, sad people that you made you want to wonder, are you okay? And take care of. What are you thinking of? But yeah, she was definitely very nurturing of him. I feel that he was a little more, in a way, attached to her, I think. Maybe that's than she was to him. But the other thing that was really interesting about Emma Mordecai um, is she was kind of a universal confidant. His last letters were to her. And then after he died, both of his parents individually sort of almost acting as though they were, in a way, kind of living their dead son, like becoming him. They each maintained their own correspondence, kind of picking up where Gratz left off. His final letters on the battlefield to her, um, which only got delivered after he was dead, and then the parents had their relationship with her, and they, especially Solomon, felt more able to be openly emotional, which is extremely shocking for anyone who knows anything about Solomon Cohen, a very stern person, very tough. So that was interesting too, that she kind of created that space for people to be open and honestly emotional, which is surprising considering her journal. It's not a very emotional type document itself. She's just a very
No.
keen observer, but definitely not a mushy type person, the way people seem to be come around her. So she must have been a very
Yeah.
good listener, I think. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think also the family's turning to her sort of speaks to some of what you get at with the Civil War of, when we sort of history buffs look back at the past, I think it's easy to focus on the battles and the sort of glory that people are trying to seek. But there really is this sort of deep, heavy emotional toll that it takes on both Northerners and Southerners. In terms of the vast quantities of people who died and men who died very young, and whose bodies his family is able to find his body, but um, so many bodies were lost, and there was just no way to mourn for people. And so I think that reaching out to Emma Mordecai sort of speaks to that larger loss that goes on during this time period, both during and following the war, of like how to grapple with the sort of enormity of the front, and the fact that certainly within his own family, but for many families, particularly Jews, that there was this thing that you were potentially fighting members of your family on the opposite side.
yeah, absolutely. This is definitely true for this story, where for in this family where, Rebecca Gratz was certainly anti-slavery and living in Philadelphia, who had raised Miriam Cohen, Gratz's mother, after Miriam's mother died. And it was really interesting just to see the way Miriam at least sort of danced around the subject in letters, when Rebecca she loved to have a good gossip, I think, and she loved, almost in a way, taunting Miriam. And oh, I ran into Lucretia Mott. She would never believe what she said. What do you think? And Miriam kind of respectfully, um, didn't argue in these letters. So
Yeah, yeah, I think it is sort of interesting how much we get a sense through documents like the letters of the personalities of the different people, and how I would agree with you that I feel like Rebecca Gratz is so much. We think of her as this major philanthropist, which she is, and this major figure in terms of starting Jewish day schools and starting women's sewing societies and starting an orphan asylum and all sorts of
hmm,
amazing things that she does. But she's also a social queen, right? She's so
absolutely.
connected to everybody. And so the fact that the wife of the main person who owned your house, Solomon Cohen, is her niece, who was raised by her, who's educated to be this sort of leader of Jewish society, I think really speaks to sort of what I was saying before, that this is a family that's so well connected to just what's going on across the United States during this time period.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's why when I imagine Miriam kind of moving down literally to the swamps, first Georgetown, South Carolina, tiny little town, and her, Rebecca was openly skeptical, like, you're living here? What? Why? Is there going to be a doctor there? If and she was just openly relieved when Solomon moved to the big city of Savannah to seek his fortune. She's like, now you will find, you know, she Rebecca writes in a wonderfully pedagogical tone. no matter who she's writing to. So she's always explaining things, and she explains to Miriam, kind of breathes a sigh of relief in this letter that I'm so glad you've moved to Savannah, because intellectual society offers the most fertile ground for advancement. And she was imagining like a little mini, I suppose, Philadelphia, which she would have conversations with smart people. So I don't know if it quite panned out that way, but it certainly was a more interesting and stimulating place, I think, for Miriam Cohen than Georgetown, South Carolina. So
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's sort of interesting how I know when Miriam's in Georgetown that she's part of a women's sewing circle, so she sort of brings that tradition from her aunt down south and is
mm.
making quilts with a group of women for people who are moving to Savannah. So it's so interesting in this book to see her moving to Savannah herself and like taking on the sort of big social world of Savannah and clearly again being so well connected. Um, one of the things that's really cool about your book is that you include a lot of great photos in it, which I'm sure that there were things that I know every time I put a book together, I'm like, how many pictures can I include? Um, um, but I'm sort of curious if you have like a favorite photo or image or something like that that you found while you were doing this that you felt like helped you understand things
What
well. I could.
motivated? Yeah, I'm just looking at the book. Well, what motivated me in writing this book, as I do in what makes me excited if I'm writing a story, is just that idea of the quest to understand something. So I think that that painting that I saw at Plantation in South Georgia, yeah, that painting was interesting. The plantation plays a role in this family after the war. One of Gratz's sister marries a man, and this is his kind of ancestral rice plantation, which is no longer a rice plantation after the war. Now that you have to pay people for their labor. And now it's filled with a lot of things from the city house, a lot of furniture. But there was a painting of Gratz Cohen that looked nothing like him. In the book, I describe it as an Aryanized painting. It looks like a kind of a Van Gogh painting, but he's extremely pretty and blonde and blue-eyed, and it really doesn't look like anything that I can see in the photographic record. So that I love that painting because I was determined to kind of figure out, did he really sit for it? And when I found out finally, I think the people running this state park that where the plantation is now sort of grudgingly, reluctantly admitted that he hadn't sat for it, and it was painted, I think, in the 1920s. It started to make me wonder about as decoration in your house, you have a picture of this sort of Aryanized, very pretty picture of this Civil War hero who was an ancestor of one of the people who owned this house at one point. And it got me to kind of thinking in a larger way about how we remember Gratz Cohen. People haven't really heard of Gratz Cohen, so the idea that I'm sort of toppling some kind of great myth was maybe a little exaggerated in my mind. But nevertheless, he is remembered exactly the way it seems every other Southern soldier, Confederate soldier, was remembered, in the most heroic, um, almost surrealistic way. These aren't realistic portrayals at all. They're all gallant and resting in the fields now, and all of that. And so that's what motivated me partly, is to think what are the uses of remembering people like Gratz Cohen that way. I guess the uses are pretty obvious. It says that our cause was justified, but also is that the truth? How much truth is in that? And if there's little truth, or if it's not entirely true, kind of what is the truth? So yeah, I found out all I could about that painting, and then I kind of also, as part of the larger quest to understand Gratz Cohen, how he really died, and how he lived and how he died. I saw, oh, kind of losing my train of thought. Yeah, but as I was writing this, I was also, I think, as I put in the book, I also had sort of a little meta little voice in my head asking myself, am I contributing to this idolization of Gratz Cohen simply by writing about him? Or am I doing what I think I'm consciously doing, which is sort of busting this myth? Not to say he was a horrible person, nothing like that, but just what was the real story? Let's remember things as they really were, instead of this gauzy lost cause way of remembering things. But certainly in the back of my head, I was thinking, you're kind of, you, Jason, are kind of becoming obsessed with Gratz Cohen. Um, are you building an idol or are you toppling an idol? So that I think that tension is sort of there in in the book and in kind of my relationship with Gratz Cohen. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that kind of complicates, there's a great moment where you talk about like not just when statues come down, but when people put statues up, that it's often historically charged in a moment when the South is feeling, those Southern Confederate statues are when the South is feeling vulnerable. And so they're
Mhm.
putting up these heroes in that sort of way. But one of the things that I think is so interesting, and this sort of speaks to you saying, like, oh, here I am looking at a statue and what's happening with it, is that you're a character in this book too. And I
Mhm.
think in that sense, it provides a really interesting model for people out there who are interested in writing their own family stories or writing histories of how do I grapple with the past and what's my relationship to the past. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit about your decision to include yourself as a character in the
Yeah.
story.
Um, yeah, I, I mean, I played around with that. I think I always had the sense that I should be the guide to this strange new world. Um, the reason I felt that I should be the guide is because almost invariably, when I was working on this project, but also, I don't know, I guess from the second I left the South and went north for school, people are always asking me, "Oh, there are Jews in the South?" Right? That's the question, and so I started to, I'm trying to grapple with the nuances of slavery and Jews' relationship to um, this biblical idea of slavery versus their reality of justifying being able to own slaves. I'm trying to tell this very nuanced story where most people not familiar with this world are starting from nothing, who aren't from the South, that is, are they're Jews in the South. So I felt that I had to be kind of a stand-in for the reader. I obviously have known that there are Jews in the South, having been born there. In fact, I will tell you that the first time I ever left the South um, was for my eighth grade trip to New York. I will say that I went to a Hebrew day school through seventh grade, and most of my friends were Jewish. Even after that, I went on this eighth grade trip to New York. We took the train. We emerged into Penn Station. I remember it being smoky. That could be a cinematic effect of memory, but maybe people smoked a
Yeah.
lot back then still. The smoke cleared. I saw these like black-hatted Hasidim there. And I remember thinking, oh, they're Jews. They're Jews in New York. I mean,
Yeah.
I just knew I was coming from this sort of more or less very Jewish world, and I didn't know anything. So yes, I was equally ignorant. But so I knew there were Jews in the South, but I felt that as a stand-in for the reader, I could help by asking the naive questions that I sincerely had, like, how did these people live? Solomon Cohen. The reason I talk a lot about slavery is because not because Jews owned slaves more than non-Jews. They owned slaves proportionally to their wealth, just the way non-Jews did. And they were concentrated in cities rather than plantations, so owned fewer slaves. But I could ask questions like, how did Jews own? How did they justify owning slaves? And what did this look like? Why do you need 23 slaves, which is how many um, enslaved people Solomon had? Where did they live? What did they do? So I could ask naive questions like that. Other naive questions: why did Gratz go to war? Who would go to war for a cause like this? Well, a lot of people did, but I really wanted to ask that question. So I felt that I needed to be the narrator. My family did not arrive in the South till the 1880s and 1890s, as part of the, those that great wave of 80s and 90s from Eastern European and German Jews, were Eastern European Jews. So it was after the war. Nevertheless, after the Civil War, nevertheless, I have my own stories to tell about my family, and that I thought were sort of relevant to the story I was trying to tell. But I ended up cutting most of that kind of personal family history out, because I felt a lot of it was not as interesting, as dramatic as the story I wanted to tell. A lot of it I felt was, in a way, sort of I was sort of like doing a lot of hand wringing. I'm writing about this slave owning family. I'm not writing about abolitionists. I was trying to maybe overcompensate and establish my own credentials and make sure everybody knew what side I was on. But in subsequent drafts, I became more secure. And so a lot of the personal family history I dropped. But I did. So I feel that I'm present more as a sort of an I, like EYE, but also my kind of subjectivity, my personality, as opposed to now I'll do that kind of model, which can also work really nicely, where it's sort of alternating chapters. Here's me, here's the historical story. I don't do that, but the story is, I'm the guide throughout, and the story is also bookended in a way with sort of the story of my relationship with my father, since I do see this book as largely a story of fathers and sons, expectations of masculinity from the father, and the sons length the sons might do to kind of fulfill those expectations. So
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to turn to question and answers in about 5 minutes. So this would be a great time. If you haven't put a question in the Q&A and you want to make sure that you get it in there, put them in now. And I'll sort of ask a last question that's pressing for me. And then I'll turn to the question and answers, the questions that people have come up with for you. So I am somebody who's super into architecture and write about architecture a lot. And so I was like, a house. So I'm super interested in, I, I don't know about you, but I really feel like whether I'm looking at a synagogue or a ritual bath or a house, I learned something different by being inside of those spaces and like how you move around them. So I'm really curious if there was something, I guess two things. One, was there something that you found in the house that you want to tell us about that you think is interesting? And then second, do you want to tell us anything about what's going on with the house now? Like, I'm
um,
sort of curious, like any updates on the house?
um, yeah, I know that you're really interested in architecture, because I feel like the first conversation we had when we met, I think the first thing I said to you was from your book, of your Barbados book, was I can so clear, I will never forget the way the upper level balconies of these buildings kind of hung. It was so vividly drawn. Um, and so yeah, I'm interested in architecture too. And it the house itself was called the Solomon Cohen house because Solomon Cohen had it built. And also the entire row that it was part of, and it was dated 1875. So after the Civil War. So none of the people actually lived in this house, in this family. The Solomon Cohen owned the house. Yeah, when we bought it, the it's four flats, and it was a very grimy house. Since then, newer owners, we've kind of improved it. Now it doesn't look as I describe it, the kind of the grime, sort of historic grime on the facade, which no longer is there. But when I was writing about the house, um, I realized it was sort of a perfect sort of metaphor for the story I was trying to tell. For those of you who've been to Savannah, you'll see a lot of beautiful brick and Savannah gray brick It's a great look now. It's multicolored. It's imperfect. It just looks very real. But back then, that was not considered very refined, and so the brick was covered over with stucco and scored to look like stone. I, in my naivete, thought that I had bought. I thought it was stone, which is absurd for the Low Country of Georgia. But I thought it was a kind of a great metaphor for something that's being covered up and made to seem kind of prettier, more elegant than it really was. Savannah gray brick is kind of it's very porous and it crumbles, and these bricks were also handmade in a plantation near Savannah by slaves. So the idea of kind of covering up these bricks with plaster, making it look like a kind of an English row house as opposed to the kind of place where it's actually from, struck me as a great metaphor for maybe a lot of what this kind of lost cause historiography is doing to kind of covering up a more messy truth. So I thought this is sort of like what my quest is here, to try to see what's kind of behind this facade. So that's it.
Yeah. So I'm going to switch to some questions now for people. We're almost at 7:15. So again, keep on putting in questions if you have them. Um, Jim Talons was asking, the Gratz family in Philadelphia was a major benefactor to charities. Same Gratz family. Do you want to just explain a little bit more about like how they're connected?
Oh, the Gratz is in Philadelphia and the Gratz in Savannah. Yeah, Rebecca Gratz, who kind of probably the most famous Jewish woman of the 19th century, who Laura was talking about, great philanthropist and not just a philanthropist. The organization she founded, she was liked to work as the secretary of them, and really starting from when she was 19 years old, she was a working woman and never made a penny of salary from any of these organizations. But her sister Rachel was Miriam Cohen's mother. Miriam Cohen married Solomon Cohen. They're the family I'm writing about. So I think Miriam was 16 years old when her mother died, and Rebecca raised her in Philadelphia. As Laura was saying, kind of instilling in her values of service and traditional Judaism. And sure enough, Miriam in Savannah, as soon as she moved there, ended up, becoming the secretary of this. It's like an orphan asylum there, and also opened her, Hebrew Sunday School. Began teaching, opened her own, I would say franchise, but began teaching that as well. And also, interestingly to me, the rabbi, the synagogue at the time had no rabbi. And so they just couldn't afford a rabbi. So she and other women held a fair to raise money to fund the position of Chazan, the spiritual leader of the Sephardic synagogue, and which is exactly the kind of thing Rebecca Gratz would have done. They all sewed and sold their handiwork, and Rebecca Gratz sent some things down, but she was in a way sort of suspicious that Christian women, because they were doing this with Christian women to hold this fair. She was suspicious that they would participate in so Jewish a cause. Christians at the time were very active proselytizers, but they did contribute, and the fair was a success, and they fast forwarded. They ended up having enough money to hire a rabbi, but that in a way speaks to differences, I think, between a small town southern Jewish community where you're not living you don't have the luxury maybe of living in a Jewish ghetto or an all Jewish world. So that idea of cooperation among neighbors, non-Jewish neighbors, which was surprising to Rebecca Gratz, was something that was just natural to Miriam. So.
Yeah, so I think that segues really nicely into one of the questions that somebody named RHK had, which was what was the status of Jews in Savannah in the 1860s and 70s? And that person was also interested in like what's going on with anti-Semitism potentially during this time period.
I didn't know anything about it. My Georgia Jewish history probably went back as far as Leo Frank, and I just assumed this would be a very difficult place for Jews to live. I was surprised to see that it wasn't. Jews seemed accepted if you kind of judge by the way they participated in civic life. Uh, Solomon Cohen was held political positions. He was the mayor pro tem at one point. I really did read a lot. You know, uh, read the historical record, read the papers, especially when Solomon was running for some office. I thought I wanted to see if he'd be slandered. Um, I found one instance in which he was slandered as a Jew, but that's it. Um, I There were high rates of intermarriage. They seemed to be accepted. Solomon Cohen's two daughters married society Gentiles. It seemed to be no issue at all. The historian Mark Greenberg, who wrote a dissertation on Savannah Jews, sort of explains this phenomenon as a process of kind of becoming white, which Jews could do more easily than other ethnic groups like Irish, who are laborers, mostly at first brought over to work on the docks. Jews were white collar. They had enough money to actually do the thing that their non-Jewish neighbors were doing, the things they were doing, including owning slaves. It was a pretty, there was a path to acculturation, is what I'm saying, that allowed for acceptance. The other thing is they were considered people of the book, and this was the Bible Belt. So Jews had ins in a way that I feel made it sort of easier for them. I also think that maybe for the first time in history, Jews were considered white, or there was a way they could, by by participating in these institutions, could make themselves a sort of a way to get into the dominant group and become white, as opposed to always being just Jews and always being different. That there were ways they could make themselves more like the dominant group, and that's certainly true for Solomon Cohen's family. I mean, they were just part of society, at business worlds, social circles, which made it a little bit of a little bit difficult for Solomon Cohen, who was also Orthodox till the very end, even when his congregation's like, no, we've had it. The congregation that he was the president of, saying we're moving to reform. Solomon Cohen was against intermarriage, but his daughters, in a way, kind of took advantage of the social openings that he himself gave them, to marry non-Jewish men. So I was surprised by how accepted Jews were.
Thank you. I think that segues nicely into a couple of the questions that people had about their Jewish lives in Savannah. So one of the people, Debbie, had a question about, she had visited the synagogue in Savannah and thought it was incredibly beautiful, which it is. And she wondered if you could talk a little bit about it, and whether the Cohens went there and what the relationship was to the synagogue.
Yeah, I grew up in the conservative synagogue, so that the temple that Debbie's referring to, that's one of three. That's the Reform synagogue. Yes, it's incredibly beautiful. It has a kind of a Gothic church architecture, which is was not a random choice, I'm sure. But at the time I'm writing, the synagogue was near this one block where the family lived and where my townhouse is. Now it's now a parking lot, so it took a while to find the plaque marking it. But it was just a one-room house. It also had it was kind very plain. It was founded in really when the first Jews arrived in Savannah in 1734. So it's one of the oldest congregations in the country. Obviously, this predated Reform Judaism, so it was an Orthodox Sephardic congregation. But one of my sources was kind of a history of the temple. So until the, I don't know, second half or middle of the 19th century, there was only one congregation, which was this congregation. So in a way, the history of the temple congregation Mikveh Israel was a history of Savannah Jews. And then then you had an Orthodox synagogue and conservative. So there are other stories to tell, but that was the story of Savannah Jews in to the mid 19th century.
Yeah, thank you. And people recognize the Mikveh Israel name as the same name as their sister congregation in Philadelphia, which is where the Gratz family went to. So it's definitely like they're part of the same Western Sephardic or Portuguese
Yeah,
Jewish
it's so confusing. I think
community.
the one in Philadelphia now in English is spelled with an H at the end of mikveh. So you have to
Yeah.
keeping that trade, and also everybody seemed to have the same names. The Jews all had the same names in the 19th century, and first names became last names, became middle names. It was extremely hard to keep track of.
Yes, I think of this as particularly the curse of doing Jewish history in the Americas during this time period. But yes, everybody, particularly in the Sephardic communities, because they name after living relatives. So if
Exactly.
somebody ever has the name Moses Lopez, I throw my hands up in despair because there's so many of them in every single city that it's like, which one do you mean? Yeah, yeah, but I thought you actually, so first of all, there is a family tree at the beginning of this, which I really appreciated, and it's like big enough font to like read and everything. And I sometimes when I'd be like, wait, who's this? I would go back to it. But I actually felt like you did a great job of keeping them separate and sort of using their nicknames that helped me understand which person you were on. Um, Somebody else had a sort of similar question, which was how Jewish were these Jewish Southerners' lives, which I think speaks to kind of what you were talking about in terms of their
Yeah.
acceptance and then also their life of the synagogue.
That's a great question. When you get to the 1840s and after the like in Beth Elohim in Charleston became the first Reform congregation. So Reform Judaism is started in this country is starting in the South. So when you have Reform Judaism in Charleston, which is just up the road from Savannah, Rebecca Gratz started getting very worried. She hadn't seen Miriam, her niece, in a long time. She was worried that Miriam might be falling into error. Even though Rebecca Gratz herself, her family was Silesian, from a German state, and these winds of enlightenment that Rebecca Gratz, definitely did not approve of, started sweeping the nation. She started sweeping the South. She was worried that maybe Miriam was not keeping a traditional home. I don't know whether she sent Miriam's sister Sarah as a spy or whether Sarah just went there on her own. But Sarah reported back that her home was, she definitely kept a traditional Jewish home. But one thing that's was interesting to me was the ways in which, in the context of keeping a Jewish home, Jews lived like of necessity, like their neighbors. I mean, the synagogue could arrange. There were letters about trying to get a shochet to slaughter the kosher meat and getting matzah. But I mean, there was a limit to how much they could do. There's a really at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans. There's like a little exhibit of Miriam Cohen's recipe book, and it has this is clearly someone who's in touch with their Judaism. The sponge cake recipe is for Pesach sponge cake, not Passover. Pesach sponge cake. There's a recipe for charoset. She knew Hebrew. She taught Hebrew school. But yet the recipe itself for the Pesach sponge cake involves half a pound of flour. And so flour we don't eat on Passover. So that the little legend in the museum is trying to make the point about how in these small Jewish towns, how there was a kind of um, there was a sort of a mixing with the influences from non-Jewish larger world were sort of filtering in. So I think that was true to some extent in Miriam's home. I know that Gratz talked about eating oysters when he was in Virginia. but certainly Solomon Cohen believed that he was keeping, a strict Jewish home, and that was what Miriam too kind of tried to maintain. So.
So you had mentioned that Solomon's daughters had married out. And so somebody was wondering whether they raised their children as Jews. And then somebody else had asked whether there are any members of the Cohen family. And I think they mean like this Cohen family as opposed to like just Cohens in general, still living in Savannah, and if they identified as Jews.
Yeah, they don't identify as Jews, but yeah, it's a really interesting question. Gratz's sister Belle, also a name that absolutely everyone, including the horse, has in my story. They're all called Belle. Belle's, her daughter, one of her daughters married a man named Hunter. Hunter is a big name in Savannah. There was a World War I flying ace who actually came back from war in World War II, named Monk Hunter, and they named the Army Air Force base there after him. So everybody knows the name Hunter. So there are a lot of hunters still around. They're not Jewish, but Miriam's granddaughter, Miriam's daughter, Belle, at one point she actually asked, she wrote a letter to her daughter, Fanny. Writing the letter was a really bizarre thing to do because they actually lived in the same house. But she wrote her this letter giving her a choice, saying, I don't know, Fanny was 16 years old, maybe, saying, you now must choose a religion. It's especially important for a woman to have a religion. Both the goal of all religions is to be good to your fellow person. It doesn't matter which one you choose, as long as you choose one. It's kind of an amazing letter. In a way, it seems to me that I kind of read it. There's more to the letter. I kind of read it as, I think there's something like, as you know, I am Jewish, but in a way, it was sort of Belle proclaiming her own Jewishness and making it kind of a viable choice. Fanny did not end up choosing Judaism, I don't think. I don't know that much about her, but I know the family didn't end up remaining Jewish. But yeah, that's so yeah, they married out, and when I do meet hunters, they especially some of the older ones who remember some of the old timers, not Belle Cohen, but heard stories about kind of Miriam Cohen and Belle. It's with a sort of fondness, like, oh yeah, we knew we had Jewish ancestors. It's always the same kind of, yeah, it was so cool. It's just a very interesting response, I think. So
Thank you. I think where time is out, but I want to try and hold up the book so people can see it again. I guess it's like, doesn't like, maybe if I let you see my horrible background, people can try and unblur it. Boop, there, the book. So definitely people would join me in thanking Jason so much
thank you so
for
much. I
sharing
really
this book
enjoyed
with
it.
us. And thank you to everybody in the audience for joining us tonight, and have a great evening.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.